Thank you so much. I hope I can be heard clearly. May I seek feedback whether I can be heard clearly?
We can hear you loud and clear, Sir Jerome.
Thanks, Carrie. I'd like to greet subsequent participants coming from the state universities and colleges, and of course, the national government agencies. The overview that I will be sharing this afternoon, I will concentrate on the conceptual and operational frameworks covering the climate change action of the Philippines. And this is both uh, centered on what adaptation, what mitigation is all about, and our legal basis is the National Climate Change Action Plan pursuant to Republic Act 9729 as amended by Republic Act 10174. And there are other subsequent laws that have considerations for climate change. And therefore, this orientation will provide additional platform for agencies to clarify some concerns how to tag. And we will answer some questions later on. Why is it important to tag that really typifies the accurate attribution of agency or instrumentality PAPs that will allow us to track domestic actions on climate change. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Colleagues, dear principals present, for the overall context, the NCCAP or the National Climate Change Action Plan has the following thematic priorities. We have food security, water security, ecological environmental stability, human security, sustainable energy, climate smart industries and services, knowledge and capacity development. Overall, just for a brief guidance, these thematic priorities are actually scattered across agencies, across instrumentalities, even SUCs, and we can also identify them in the various local plans of our LGUs. Basically, these are what we call the necessary areas of services where public goods and public services ought to be anchored on to constitute our agency PAPs. To use the budget language, these are what we spend for that will be tracked over time. And what we do in CCET is we just concentrate the focus or the dominant element of every PAP that will be responsive to the requisites of the thematic priorities. Why do we need to do that? It's actually both a disclosure of agency focus and also the reflection of agency priorities in light of the prevailing increasing impacts of climate change. And these are the very core of the public goods and services that are needed by our people, needed by our institutions in making sure that our budget using climate lens would be responsive to navigate all of us so that we will not just survive, but of course, this budget will allow us to open up opportunities to develop in this era of low carbon development and sustainable development in the course of time. So this is just an introduction for agency reflection. What is the structure or composition of our budget? How do we respond to the various requisites of the NCCAP that will have the welfare of the people at the end of the day as the targets of our budget? Next slide. Just to present a processual discussion, we have here two basic columns, the inputs column and the process column. Now for the inputs column, this will be guiding the agencies in order to contextualize their mandates, their core business deliverables, their respective major final outputs, That should be the inspiration or motivation for crafting annual budget. So we have here the bigger plans of government, ambition natin 2040, the SDGs, the Philippine Development Plan, and a host of others that will allow us to see which space is allotted for our agency to make sure that we are really part of the whole of government solution to climate change. We also see here sectoral plans and programs, the National Adaptation Plan, which is an ongoing process, the National Climate Risk Management Framework, which we have issued also in consonance with the conduct of the National Stocktake for the National Climate Risk Management Framework. We have the nationally determined contribution, which is our submission to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change last year, espousing a -75 ambition for emission avoidance with concomitant services for adaptation. So these are supported by cross-cutting measures such as financing gaps analysis, capacity needs analysis, technology needs analysis, and R&D agenda. Now, we would like to underscore that these boxes are actually not new because they also help shape the directions in undertaking various governmental and non-governmental complementation and activities concerning the 7 thematic priorities of the NCCAP. Now, in terms of process, we see here whole of government steering in as much as we know our stakeholders. That would account for the LGUs, that would account for industries, that would account for our communities. The constituencies are dependent on the agency mandates, and therefore there are a host of programs that might be tagged that would seek to capacitate or empower these constituencies or stakeholders in relation to achieving the NCCAP targets. Now we have agency consultation and collaboration, partnerships and linkages, coordination with the National Panel of Technical Experts as one of the measures to ensure that our PAPs would have scientific considerations. We also have nexus analysis for adaptation and mitigation, thematic sectors, and use of climate information. And it's really an iterative or work in progress approach in considering the harmonization of our sectoral priorities and timelines. And what is important is institutional capacity. And this is one of the reasons why the CCC, in cooperation with other national government agencies, I would like to really welcome all participants annually to make sure that we share the updates on the ongoing developments on the CCET process. If there are new scientific information that can be considered by the agencies in crafting their PAPs, this upscaling or enhancing of the PAPs is commendable because that responds to the responsiveness of our budget structure. Because given the vulnerability of the country, just to cite as an example, there are certain programs and projects that need to be scaled up or need to be downscaled or need to be, consolidated with other PAPs just to ensure that we optimize the resources that would be allotted to us from our national budget. Now, with a specific regard for GOCCs and SUCs, there are certain defined constituencies, and we can all have that space to be creative in reflecting inwards and outsides. What would be the other enhancements that can be included in this round of CCET and budget preparation exercises. So these concepts will help us configure on the responsiveness, efficiency, perhaps economy or effectiveness, and looking with emphasis, looking into what our impacts to the ground level activities of governance, especially that we underscore the fact that our LGUs or the people on the ground would carry the first impacts or would experience the worst impacts, but at the same time, conversely, they should be assisted in making sure that they also experience the early benefits of doing adaptation activities consonant with our NCCAP, in accordance with our uh, RA 9729, but also inspired by our with our ambition natin. So this iterative process, this conversation will allow us to interact with one another to ensure that the input-output relationship of agency PAPs would enhance the impact as desired. Next slide. We have here the presentation on the non-negotiable elements of our nationally determined contribution. When the President assigned the accession to the Paris Agreement in 2017, there are four fundamental non-negotiables, meaning to say that we champion all these four, that we will go with the Paris Agreement so long as these four are uh, are championed. We have sustainable industrial development, poverty eradication and provision of basic needs, securing social and climate justice and energy security. In our national strategic framework on climate change, we recite there or we ordain there that mitigation will be pursued as a function of adaptation, as adaptation is our anchor strategy. Colleagues, this is one articulation of what climate justice is all about, that as a highly vulnerable economy, we are not a major emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. We only emit 0.3% against the global average. But at the same time, on one hand, if you analyze, we spend much more to bring back better. So funding for adaptation is our anchor strategy, simply because that no economic vehicle would ever be sustained or would ever be enhanced in the course of time if we will not prioritize building our institutions, making sure that our people are provided the basic needs in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So in our NDC, we say there that a projected GHG emission or avoidance of 75% would be predicated on these two important considerations. 2.71% is unconditional, which means to say that we do not need external support for us to leverage on our 2.71 commitment. This is because we have that share of duty to ensure that we also build our public goods and services and deliver them based on what's funded under our domestic source, and that's our national budget. But on the other hand, 72.29% is conditional. That means to say that we can only commit to those services, to those technology options that would allow emissions avoidance in the future if external support would be delivered to us. That delivery of means of implementation is ordained under the Paris Agreement, where developed countries are mandated to assist the developing countries to cope with the impacts of climate change. So we underscore a national circumstance approach. We will need support based on the actual circumstances. And so this climate change expenditure tagging is one piece of evidence to manifest how vulnerable we are, but at the same time, how committed we are to our people and institutions. But we underscore that these domestic resources are not enough, because the investments, the technology shifts, the capacity building needs would require much more. And we look at external support bilaterally or multilaterally to ensure that the adaptation and mitigation needs are met over time. So that's a basic premise. We tag because that's one way of ensuring that we provide evidence for climate justice that we claim globally. Next slide, please. So for adaptation, this is just a reiteration that it refers to the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. In simple terms, adaptation would respond to what will make our vulnerable communities adaptive to climate change. What would be the capacity needs? What would be the public goods and services that will increase the resilience of our local communities to climate change? So that's basic, that's the laymanized question contexts when we try to meet with our agency principals and planning officers. What does this particular PAP answer? So if it's going to be adaptation, does this budget help contribute the increasing of the adaptive capacity of our communities? Next slide, on mitigation. Mitigation, on the slide, it says, in the context of climate change, mitigation refers to human intervention to address anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks all greenhouse gases, including ozone-depleting substances and their substitutes. In simple terms, colleagues, fellow workers in government, in GOCCs, SUCs, and NGAs, this question answers, how do we avoid GHGs? What will allow us to reduce emissions? Is that a technology? Is that a service? Is that an activity or a capacity building intervention? Is that research? So we will ask, what is the focus of this expenditure? If the focus is reducing or avoiding future emission, then that's mitigation. If the answer is securing the welfare of our people from the natural climatic drivers, based on the hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposure or risk assessments, then that would be adaptation. At this point, it's good to mention as well the code for mitigation. We have AWITFE. These are our emitting sectors: agriculture, waste, industry, transport, forestry, energy. So if the departments having regard for this AWITFE would consider avoiding emissions through, say, technology, new ways of doing facilities, or producing farm implements, that would, lessen GHG, then that would be mitigation. But if the focus of any intervention is to make resilient agriculture to flooding, for example, or making our livestock more susceptible to hazards, and then to correct that, say, relocating our farms, for example, then that would be adaptation. Failing which, kung walang produksyon ang Department of Agriculture, then more or less we are addressing concerns on food security. So something like that po. Now, paano yung research? Maybe let's ask, ano ba yung focus ng research? Is it to increase adaptation or to increase mitigation or to do both? Then do natin i-apply siguro yung proportionality, but we will entrust the nuanced process to the number of our CCET help desk. This is just to illustrate in a creative, perhaps, or free-flowing manner that it's really a conversation to make that careful and informed evaluation of our PAP. Next. This slide is actually a technical paper from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We see here the, interplay of the Paris Agreement on climate change adaptation and mitigation, and we see here UNFCCC. We also see here disaster risk reduction or Sendai framework, and then we also see here the Sustainable Development Goals or Agenda 2030. So these are the major considerations, major plans upon which, some of our rethinking based on our PAPs, depending on the agency mandates and agency FFOs, MFOs, or performance informed budgets. These will be some references because what we what we explain is that our budget, being the language of development, should allow a structure that would really respond to, at the end of the day, public goods and services needed by our people, by our communities, by our institutions, and even to the benefit of our non-government actors, because we are talking here of an economy-wide, low-carbon, and sustainable development over time. Now, we're looking at 2050 horizon, and since our budget is annual, but we have some medium-term instruments, like a PDP, which is 6 years, for example, we have to already practice the application of scientific projection, such that addressing a climate change adaptation needs would require time. And so the planning and programming, supported by policy considerations, must already be embedded in our agency operations. So we can only thrive, or we can only survive and thrive in the era of climate change if you're going to reduce the vulnerability and to enhance resilience over time. One way to calculate this in a very concrete manner is we can aspire for reduction of our loss and damage in GDP equivalent over time. So this would require the testing of the plausibility of our PAPs, whether or not we really target the outcomes desired in our budget. So this is really a dialogue that will warrant certain clarifications or inquiry further into the responsiveness of our PAPs, whether we really consider risk assessments, we really consider last mile approach in the budget planning and strategies. Like, we ask ourselves how the communities will be benefited by our respective budgets. But this reflection should be carefully guided by our respective mandates, and the shepherding of our oversight agencies is of paramount importance, such that, as provided or articulated by ASEC Aklazara earlier during the budget forum, it was already underscored the importance of tagging exercise. Next slide. So these are key messages from the technical paper, and I will not mention all of these, but just to highlight some key points. There should be policy integration and coherence. So it is desired that while we are tagging our budgets, we already have the PDP in mind as well. We have the national and local circumstances as well. What will our people need over time to bring back better, to make sure that we help reduce or avoid GHGs in the atmosphere, but at the same time, there's that calibrated or measurable progress that we do when we try to build capacity on the ground. And then, of course, it would require better data management system. And so it's important that the quality assurance process will be also taken or conducted seriously as we try to do baseline in this process. Baseline would tell us how far we have gone in terms of progress, or which areas would need more assistance in terms of agency appreciation or agency mastery of the CCET process. Next slide. So just a quick overview of adaptation needs of the country. We can refer to this diagram. What are slow onset events and extreme events? Failing to act on these events will exacerbate or will increase our cost of loss and damage. And over time, we will know that whatever we build should withstand the test of time. And then for communities, let's make sure that they are protected socially. So there are social safeguards. So there are instrumentalities and agencies of government that would help in this regard. So for economic losses, we see here some illustration, and also physical assets. And then we also hear non-economic losses. So there are losses that are economic, there are losses that are non-economic. So it's important to also consider these elements in making enhancements in our PAPs. Okay, so this is a very interesting slide that presents climate change drivers. And if we see in the next slide, may mga mas granular pong example. So ito yung mga sinasabi nating drivers, and ito yung mga kailangan din natin tingnan. We have a presentation by the NPTE, I think after me, at mas mai-explain po doon yung sinasabing top 10 climate risks in a prioritization context. Ano po yung kumbaga parang kaagaran na sana'y matugunan ng ating pamahalaan na ma-address dahil doon po nakasalalay ang ating economic development, pati yung social safeguards sa ating mga kababayan, especially now that we are also incorporating green recovery paradigm for our PAPs. Next slide. Ito po yung ating multi-decadal approach to climate change planning and programming, at ito po ay nababase rin sa masusing pagtingin sa anong pwede nating references sa pag-craft ng ating budget. So meron tayong scientific grounding through the National Climate Risk Management Framework. Meron din tayong climate risk data generation at risk evaluation. Maganda po kung maitatanong natin sa pagka-craft ng ating PAPs, ano ba yung pronounced climate shocks that would be essential to be incorporated in the design of our PAPs. We see here the 7 thematic priority areas and also the interplay of the national and local governments. Pero meron din po tayong sinasabi na progression from National Climate Change Action Plan. Kung masusi po natin itong mabibigyan ng halaga, then pwede na po itong i-dovetail kaagad sa ating PDP o ambisyon natin, at ganun din po sa National Disaster Risk and Management Plan. Kasi ito naman po ay kailangang holistically na ma-consider, because we are trying to document what can we ask for in our fight for climate justice. Ano po ba yung kailangan natin? So evidentiary po yun. So yun po yung halaga kung bakit tayo nagtatag. And there are cross-cutting strategies that we might also consider in the course of our work, like R&D, technology development, financing, and capacity development. Now, regard for the vulnerable communities and sectors would also be very important, because we have to install a holistic process in this regard, like in the crafting of technology needs. For example, isa-isip natin na marami tayong mga kababayan na differently abled, or talagang by the nature of work or in yung pagrespeto natin, for example, sa indigenous peoples, kailangang maibigyan din natin ng kaukulang pagtugon para nang sa ganon holistic po ang ating kapamaraanan. Now, ang importante po as NGAs or instrumentalities or SUCs, the finer results can be manifested by the way our communities behave, doon sa impact po ng ating interventions, in the convergence of all our mandates. At the end of the day, what we aspire for Filipinos would be matatag, panatag, masaganang pamayanan. Ayun po ay ambisyon natin, but isa po na madaling paraan para maisakatuparan yon is magtag tayo. Hindi ito isang adversarial na proseso, kundi isa po itong paraan para matugunan natin ano pa ba yung ibang tulong na hindi natin gaano napapansin. So the rethinking process, the strategic policy directions, and the crafting of responsive budgets would be valuable dito po sa ating exercise. I think next slide, and that's going to be the last slide. Colleagues in government, why is it important to tag? At kanina nga po ay nabigyan ko na kayo ng parang ibang idea, but CCET as a monitoring and evaluation tool for climate change actions with domestic funding. Ito po ay paraan ng pagtatrack ng ating priorities that would require new allocation, tier 1, tier 2, or kailangan mag-rechannel ng resources. So hindi po ito talagang pang-accounting na process lang. plus plus kung kailangan ng more. Bakit? Sana po medyo may lapat na scientific explanation na halimbawa binagyo doon, so maraming build back better requirements. So ganun po natin sana i-design yung ating PAPs. So hindi po siya business as usual kung baga. So lalo na po dun sa mga hardly hit areas, kailangan matingnan natin what would be needed in terms of adaptation. Iba po naman yung disaster risk reduction, for example, kasi response siya or a recovery or rehab. Ang climate change adaptation is actually futuristic, slow onset process, na kahit walang kumbaga converse po yung approach. Kung ang recovery and response ay after the event, ang climate adaptation is pre-event, ex ante. Okay? So ang kailangan nating tingnang pansin is ano yung capacities needed as a result of new technologies or yung bagong mga kapamaraanan para sabihin natin na ito kasi yung kailangang adaptation solutions. It could be engineering, it could be environmental, it could be social structures that can be in place base sa tingin natin using our mandates. And knowing what we need is a critical path towards sustainable development and climate justice. We are actually trying to install a working long-term pathway para sa ganon ang next generation, meron silang guidance sa kung ano pong tinahak natin, ano yung current circumstances na inaddress natin. And this is part of what we call planning for uncertainties. And as the saying goes before I end, we can do this together. Our combined mandates as government agencies, as agents of the people, we're required to give them no less than the best that we can do. And maraming salamat po sa tao ng pagsama sa CCET orientation at naway mas mapayapa, masagana at matatag na Pilipinas ang maialay natin sa ating mga kababayan. Maraming salamat po.